Welcome to Improsophy, where we bring living room discussions to your daily life. This week, we are currently discussing the book Aion by Carl Jung. We will be primarily talking about his ideas on the ego and the shadow, as well as a brief introduction on who the man was. Enjoy!
All right, Jordan, here we are.
Yes, here we are. Hopefully, we can be heard.
Yeah, we will be.
There we are.
So we were reading a new book, Aion by Carl Jung.
Very, I don't know. This book is so far just blowing my mind. And what I'm more surprised about is that I'm actually understanding what's being said, because I don't know, my brain can understand these things somehow.
Yeah, that's a good teaser. Yeah, let's just start with who is Carl Jung.
Yeah. From what I know, he's a Swiss psychologist in the um, early 20th to mid 20th century. Yeah, I know. Fun fact: he had two mistresses. Not joking. I read in a book called Introducing Jung. It was a good book, giving a very broad overview of who he was. But he had a very interesting mind. So it's almost like he was able to compartmentalize his spiritual mind and his uh, psychology, where he was able to interact with people very well, where he would have this kind of mental epiphany in one day, and then right in the next moment be able to interact with people in his day-to-day life.
Yeah, so Jung, he was you're right, early 20th century to mid 20th century psychologist. He worked with Freud for a while, and he parted ways with Freud's theories kind of early in his career.
Mm-hmm.
His big idea was archetypes, that we have these arche meaning old, type being type, like we have these old types of thinking in our minds basically, and that they're universal across the human condition. Jung, yeah, he studied a lot of symbols. He studied a lot of personality types. He's where you get the terms introvert and extrovert. He was the first one to think that someone's personality interacts with the environment differently, whether, I think he said, like, for the extrovert, the psychic energy flows out of the person through the environment and back to him, and to the introvert, it flows from the environment through them. I don't I think that's kind of a wacky way of phrasing it, but anyway, he created introvert and extrovert, and Myers-Briggs is eventually based on him. What else? He kind of had a architecture of the soul.
Explain that to me, because I'm not quite sure what you mean by that.
Yeah, so some people, they get into philosophical conversations, and their their ideas of the soul kind of just end at the mind body problem. Like, oh, mind and body, it's weird. I don't feel like matter being a conscious person, but I got this whole body deal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's kind of the depth of a lot of people's philosophical understanding. Now, there's another group of people that have actually tried to take like the soul and partition it into pieces. For Aristotle, he thought there was the vegetative soul, the part of the soul that is just growing and becoming and nourishing, and then there's the animal soul, which is responsible for emotions, and then there's the human soul, which is rational. So there are people that actually attempt to articulate the structure of what the soul is. For Jung, the psyche is the word for the soul. When he talks about psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, he actually sees it as a soulish element. This also brings us to the idea that Jung is a mystic. Later in his career, people asked him, do you believe in God? because he didn't really fit into the categories of the day. And his response was, I know God. And Jung, he's kind of a weird guy. Like when he retired, his retirement was literally just building a castle
Hmm.
because that's what he always wanted. Um,
I did not know that. Continue.
yeah, he's a weirdo.
I like him already. Well, I mean, I've already liked him, but the way you're describing him, I like him even more.
Oh yeah, and the main. This is the last thing.
I want to know more about that castle. I have to look that up later.
Yeah, yeah. It was like some weird. I think it's like British '60s documentary, and Jung was talking in like a weird Swiss accent and trying to do English. What else? Jung. Yeah, he also traveled cultures a lot. He would look at a people group and try to understand their mythology. So he's very widely read across cultures. I think he was pretty early in not just taking a European centric view of the world. He really cared about all peoples, tribes, tongues, etc. The last main thing about Jung is this distinction between the conscious and unconscious mind. Would you want to take a stab at how that's kind of understood?
Yeah, for the conscious mind it's kind of obvious what you're conscious of your own thoughts. Then there's also the underlying part of yourself where you have thoughts going on in the background of your mind that you are not fully aware of. So let's say uh, you're going throughout your day and then all of a sudden you think of a certain thought and you're like, where did that come from? It's kind of like that. You have underlying things going on within your mind that you're not even fully aware of. Now, in regards to where the subconscious or the unconscious part of the self can manifest itself, sometimes in dreams, and I'm kind of drawing a blank on that. Can you help me understand how that can manifest itself in dreams, Cory?
Yeah, I guess dreams can tell you a lot about your motivations about the world. Uh, it also can just spontaneously create narrative, which is very interesting. Um, yeah, so I think it can kind of tell you stuff about yourself that you aren't directly trying to manifest or create.
Hmm. I remember having, this is just a side tangent. I remember years ago having dreams about tornadoes, and I was having parts of my soul, so to speak, being destroyed. Then some years later, I was also having a dream of tornadoes, but water was involved. So I would say because of that, um, the water, this time the tornadoes represented probably destruction of whatever was destroying my soul with the water, because the water can represent renewal and hydration if you're parched for your soul.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of how to get into the conscious and unconscious.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, I think it's like this threshold of awareness. Things can happen underneath of it. Underneath of it, man.
So many layers.
Yeah, think of, here's a wacky example. I remember in English class, we're talking about Shakespeare, and the whole thing is iambic pentameter. So it's 2 beats, 5 of those double beats per line. And they always told you that it was the 2 beats is the same as like the heartbeat or the step. So when you're running fast, your heart's beating fast, it kind of speeds up. And the way I heard my English teacher read the Shakespeare was that it kind of sped up when she was reciting more dramatic parts of it. And part of it just like struck me in like a certain depth where I wasn't really like aware of the like 2 beat heartbeat thing, but it was still like under the surface. So yeah, Jung thought that beneath the surface, like the threshold of being aware, there's kind of a bunch of associations that happen, like things are linked together in certain ways, and these associations under the surface can kind of, what's the word, like calcify into little clusters, and they can become, for Freud he'd call them like complexes. For Jung he preferred the term archetype. That the associations actually cluster into little balls of associations. And he actually went a step further. It's not just that we think associatively, and it's not just that these associations ball up. It's also that these associations gain some amount of autonomy under our level of consciousness. So you could be doing something and maybe act in a way that you're not used to, and that's actually like a force subsurface that's trying to tell you something, or making you behave in these weird ways. So yeah, his view of the unconscious, it wasn't just, primitive drives like Freud. He'd say, oh, the unconscious mind is always seeking reproduction. His view that it was a lot more linked into myth and personal narrative. So getting into this chapter, that is a lot of background on Carl Jung. Oh yeah, we're reading Aion by him, which is volume 9, part 2.
Yeah, we're starting right in the middle of all of his works here, everybody.
Good old volume 9.5. That's it's like the Harry Potter train. It's
yeah. You start from book 5 of Harry Potter or something to try to understand the grandiose lore of whatever the heck it is.
Oh, I was thinking of like the fractional train station, but
oh, I see what you're saying.
My brain was
I was thinking, oh, we're just starting the middle of a trilogy, or we're starting in the middle of a 8-part book series. It's kind of like that.
That's fair.
But oh well. I feel like with what I was reading, I was surprised. I felt surprised that I was able to understand what he was saying.
So he starts his like architecture of the soul with the ego, and then the shadow. And these are the two we'll be discussing.
Yeah. I wasn't sure if you had more to say. So my first thing is the three types of ego that consist in the mind. Let me see here. Page 4. I wrote down some notes here for it. If I can get it. Yeah, page 4, paragraph 4. So I'll go ahead and read the paragraph. The somatic basis of the ego consists, then, of conscious and unconscious factors. The same is true of the psychic basis. On the one hand, the ego rests on the total field of consciousness, and on the other, on the sum total of unconscious contents. These fall into 3 groups. First, temporarily subliminal contents that can be reproduced voluntarily, or memory. Second, unconscious contents that cannot be reproduced voluntarily. Third, contents that are not capable of becoming conscious at all. Group 2 can be inferred from the spontaneous interruption of subliminal contents into consciousness. Group 3 is hypothetical. It is a logical inference from the facts underlying Group 2. It contains contents which have not yet interrupted into consciousness, or which never will. So, with that extensive reading out of the way.
Lovely.
And yes, that was me putting the book down. The 3 types of ego that consist in the mind, how often are we aware of things within our own mind that affect us on a daily basis? Did I say? Yeah, unaware.
Can you grab me? What's that page again?
Page 4, paragraph 4.
Yeah, by the way, I took 4 pages of notes on 5 pages of Jung. So.
See, you're more the note taker than I am.
Yeah. So, let's maybe we need to step back and define what the ego is.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point.
The ego is, he calls it the center of the field of consciousness. so it's like the center of the conscious mind. It's not all the conscious mind,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but it's like the center of it. It maybe is the part that um, like the makes decisions as much as the conscious mind does make decisions. Uh, he also views the ego as something that can expand, shrink, or change shape over time. That it's like developmental.
Mm-hmm.
The ego uses the phrase "always limited by the unknown," which makes sense. If it's the center of consciousness, it can't know the unknown. And Jung's view is that the ego it's not the whole of the personality.
Mm-hmm.
Just what you can articulate about yourself and the group identity you can attach to yourself, and the tribes you associate with yourself. That's not the whole of your personality. It's beyond what's articulatable.
Yeah, I actually, here's a question in relation to it. How does this compare with Freud's view of the ego? Because I know you're a bit more well versed with this.
Yeah, Freud's view is that there is a superego. This is like your ideals of like being perfect, spotless, whatever. And then he thought you had like this id, which is kind of this depraved, grotesque, just thing that wants its own desires. And Freud's view is that the ego is kind of a compromise between the id and the superego. So
repeat that one more time.
Yeah, the ego is like a compromise between the id and the superego.
Okay.
That we kind of want like dark and gritty things, but because we're around people, we kind of create the superego of how we should treat people, and then we kind of fall somewhere in the middle of fulfilling our desires partially, but also not becoming antisocial people.
Yeah, I think I kind of like Jung's view better because he seems to have a more realistic understanding of human psychology. Because from what I understand of him, human beings aren't, even if you take it from a purely naturalistic understanding, human beings aren't purely naturalistic in their mind. There are a lot of people who understand things from a spiritual perspective, even if you're not a spiritualist yourself. Does that make sense? Or is there a bit more to it than that?
I think I agree.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that passage you read, he says that there's two bases to the ego. Essentially your own sense of identity and the decision making part of your conscious mind. And he says these two bases are somatic and psychic.
Mm-hmm.
Somatic has to do with the senses. Like I was talking about iambic pentameter earlier, that's kind of a physiological thing that happens in the unconscious mind. Like you might not even know, you might realize your heart's beating fast, you didn't even know, but I guess I was scared, sure, but I kind of figured it out through my body. Sometimes you get that weird reversal of your unconscious mind knowing something and you don't. Like,
yeah.
Oh, this parking garage must be very scary because I don't know why I'm sweating. So there's a somatic, and this is like a basis to the ego. So this is, how do I word this? I guess this is kind of how the ego gets paths through the unconscious that the ego gets information. You can become consciously aware through the senses. And then the other one was psychic. And he defines psychic as a will which modifies reflex or instinctual process.
Yeah.
So it's not just that you're sensing things that you're not aware of, that the phenomenon that you take in also gets modified by something under the surface, and that's
Okay.
when you get to the associations and archetypes that uh, things are being filtered through the senses and up to your conscious mind, but along the path they get kind of modified and changed
Hmm.
a little bit.
So it's like taking something in and trying to make sense of it, kind of thing. Would you say?
I think it does have to do with sensory processing to some degree, because I'm like, you have like 7 trillion nerve endings in your body,
Mm-hmm.
and you're not going to say, oh, I know this happened because nerve ending 5,672 was tingled.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can't even be aware of all that stuff. So there has to be some amount of processing that happens between, and we're just talking about the somatic basis, but there has to be some level of abstraction that occurs between the nerve ending and the brain. Like, it has to be somehow transformed into a meaningful signal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I know what I do know what you mean by this. My thought, at least in terms of how I'm taking this in now, is I don't really think so much things in terms of sense, but more of in terms of how I think things and process them. So I'm wondering things that we still might not be aware of that we should be aware of, I guess is a good way of putting it. Or how often, going back to the question, how often are we unaware of the things in our own mind that affect us on a daily basis?
Mm.
So I guess, what are some things that do affect us that we might not be aware of? So I guess what you were mentioning about the garage being scary place, we may not realize it in that moment, and then we realize, wait, this is not a safe place. I need to get out of here. I need to get to my car real quick. Or at least there's that sense of it. Now, is it actually an unsafe place? I mean, it can depend. Do certain patterns emerge that might tell you this is not a safe place? Um, I guess I I think this might be the misuse of it, but is this a certain type of archetype that says this is an archetype of danger? Am I using that properly?
I think there is an archetype of the ancient enemy. I think as far as a creepy parking garage example, um,
Or not just parking garage, but anywhere in general that might seem unsafe.
yeah, I think archetype is when it's, um, hmm, I, I kind of want to go to this from a different angle.
Yeah,
Like,
that's fine.
Jung would think that the unconscious mind is bigger than the conscious mind, so you're taking in a lot more information, and you might not have something articulated to the conscious level, but sometimes you know things in your gut, um, for whatever reason. So Jung would say trust that feeling of being creeped out, because your body's taking in all sorts of information that it can't quite piece it together yet.
Mm-hmm.
But you should just trust your intuition on it.
Yeah, I know. I've when I was in the military, although I never experienced anything bad, did not experience a combat situation. When I was going through combat uh, classes, when I was with the unit that I was with, seeing all the different I IED explosions, so improvised explosive devices that were created and whatnot. You see people blow up and whatnot. The instructor said, trust your instinct. Because if something doesn't seem right, that can sit. If you trust your instinct, that is something that could possibly save your life.
Mm.
So I suppose it can be. I'll let you try to explain it because you seem to know a little bit more about this than I do.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, that's like a super good example. Um, hmm.
If you're not too aware of it, we can move on.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I kind of want to talk about archetype for a moment. Um, my understanding of archetype is, I guess this is kind of going back against what I was trying to mention a moment ago about an archetype of this situation. I think actually archetype might be more of a person rather than a place. So the thing that you either embody or inhabit, or that thing inhabits you, and that becomes your archetype. Now that could be going into, we'll go into it a little bit later, the shadow of what can possibly take over. But I suppose an archetype could be the very thing that you're putting on. But that sounds more like a persona. I think archetype, mind you, I'm trying to connect the dots here. I promise.
Yeah.
I think archetype is something that represents a thing. So the archetype of the mother, or the archetype of the father, the archetype of the beast, the archetype of the savior, the archetype of the companion pet, so to speak.
Yeah. And archetypes, like, they are on a narrative time scale. Like the being in a garage and being freaked out. I don't think that's like necessarily the archetype.
Yeah.
Because that's just like an immediate response. I think archetypes are conflicts that kind of go on within your mind over like weeks and months of kind of finding resolution with yourself.
That's a better way of putting it. So ignore what I said about the garage trying to be an archetype of something.
But like archetypes, they have some amount of, they're like cartoon characters, A.
Yeah.
And then B, they have some amount of autonomy about how you perceive the world.
Yeah. Reminds me, I haven't watched much of it, but the anime JoJo's Bizarre Adventure with stands.
Oh my gosh.
I've only gotten up to season 3, halfway through it, but you have these things that, these creatures that come out of a person, so to speak, they fight each other. So it's basically either an archetype or persona of a person is fighting against the other archetype or persona of a person. But that's neither here or there right now. I was just trying to give an example.
Yeah, so maybe I'll say this more succinctly. So the ego, it's kind of like the executive office of the brain. You can think of it like that, like the president's desk, and ideas come to it and then a decision's made. Although who writes the proposals, there's some amount of change in there. But yeah, Jung's idea of the phenomenology of how you experience phenomenon is that it starts at an unconscious level and it kind of filters through the unconscious mind, from starting from your senses and then going through the unconscious. And then it passes through like the threshold of consciousness, and then it goes to the ego, which is like the center of consciousness, and then a person makes a decision. You can think of it almost like, do you know like those rain sticks? It's like a tube, it has pegs in it different ways and it has rice, and you turn it upside down.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
So Jung's view is it's kind of like you have these sensory inputs, and then so the rice is kind of like maybe just like the flow of experience or the phenomenon through you. And the tube is kind of your somatic routing, that it's literally from your senses, so from your 7 trillion nerve endings up to a level of abstraction that you can make a decision. And then the pegs in the rain stick, they're kind of like your associations or just kind of psychic modifiers to the path of information. So you don't just take in info through senses like a computer. Like, his thought is that like phenomenon, they kind of bounce through you and ricochet off things, and echo through you,
Mm-hmm.
that you don't just logically like um, get feedback. It's abstracted, and this rice going through the rain stick, it's going through the unconscious mind and bouncing off all sorts of associations you made, all sorts of muscle memory, all sorts of archetypes, all sorts of deep ingrained human symbologies of what things mean. Uh, and this also comes to another level of abstraction where, like, you can make a diagram. I pick up a ball, it goes through the senses, it goes through my
Mm-hmm.
sensory cortex and my motor cortex. Me picking it up goes through my visual cortex, me seeing it. And that's a pretty disinteresting example. For Jung, he would think the more interesting examples is social interactions. That's when it really starts to go through a lot more of the archetypes and deep-seated associations we have. So, yeah, he's not just viewing senses as a textbook, black and white, what's your reaction time, or stuff like that. He sees the senses also encompassing very abstract social interactions, and that filtering through the unconscious and bumping and echoing and bellowing around and then coming to the conscious mind.
Hmm. I guess that can lead up to my next question. Why do we not always know what causes our actions?
Yeah, I think that's the thing when we sense. So there's the somatic basis and the psychic basis. The somatic is just your senses, and the psychic is all that bouncing around. I think it's like we don't even know. We don't know why things ring chords in us when we experience things. Sometimes it rings a resonant chord or a dissonant chord, or or Jung would say that there's like an archetype in the unconscious that has some amount of autonomy that's kind of warping the way we see the world as well.
Mm-hmm.
That it's having its share of modifying what we consciously perceive.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's a complicated answer, but it's really like it going through the abstraction phase. It bounces around and does a lot of things that we can't know.
Yeah. So I guess it's like taking in information but not knowing what to do with it, would you say? At least sometimes. Because
Yeah,
that's what it kind of sounds like to me anyways.
I don't know if it's like an information thing. Like, I don't know if it's a memory problem.
Right.
I think it's more of like a resonance problem. Like, you hit a wine glass with a little mallet and it rings at a certain frequency. It's like when we experience certain things, it has this like resonance response or something.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you were to say, let's just remove the somatic basis of the ego, okay, you're just a brain in a in a vat of something, and you have no senses to the world. And I don't think Jung would really view that as living if it's a brain on a stick or a brain in a vat.
Mm-hmm.
I think Jung's view is that the brain's very coupled to the body, and to take away either of these, you're removing the dynamic part of the human experience, the dialogue with reality. So, like to say, if your brain's in a if your brain's in a vat, like, do you have archetypes? I think to him that's kind of a disinteresting question, because it doesn't actually connect to narrative. Like, if your brain's in a vat, then you're good as dead would be the
Mm-hmm.
other way of thinking about it.
Yeah. I guess part of it is, now bringing it down to a more practical level, I think there are times in our lives where we're just not always aware of things. Some things are just not oblivious to us. And there are times in life when others around us will notice certain things about us that we ourselves are not fully aware of.
Mm.
Yeah. So my question to connect with everything that you're saying is, how can we be more aware of our own actions that might cause hindrance to either ourselves or others?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and Jung's thought is that, like, although a lot of things happens in the unconscious mind, that sometimes it breaks through, like having a fantasy or a dream or a vision,
Mm-hmm.
that this weird unconscious material becomes like manifested and you don't really know what it means, and he would think it has a lot that it could tell you about yourself. Yeah, you definitely can learn about yourself through others. I think that's a little limited as far as what you can internalize. Um, and this will get into the shadow later, but he also has this idea of projection, that the human mind is capable of a lot of positive feedback loops, and you can get into places where you only see what you're looking for,
Mm-hmm.
and you're kind of blind to what the reality is.
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose I think that when taking in a lot of that information might be an overload. So I wonder if it's, like you were mentioning, trying to process a narrative through certain signs and symbols in order to better understand what we're going through. So let's say somebody, going back to the whole soldier thing, a former soldier relating things in military terms, or a psychologist relating things in psychological terms, or somebody who's whatever religion they might be relating it to themselves in or others in certain religious terms.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if integrating that into themselves is trying to make sense of the world around them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, on the religion side, Jung's view that is that religion is a system of symbols that helps you navigate the world.
Mm-hmm.
That's his view, that it's like a complete set of the symbols that could it's like a full dictionary of symbols that can help you navigate what's going on. So yeah, as far as having a same emotional response but it taking on a different familiar form for you, I think you're right on as far as that.
Yeah. I'm trying to keep up with the conversation because you seem like you're a bit more familiar with Jung than I am, and I'm saying that just to be honest, because this is my own personal thing to try to have a more integrated personality. I try to be as honest with people as possible. So, although I did understand what I was reading in terms of Jung, you seem to know more background information on Jung and his thoughts. But that doesn't mean that I'm not going to be able to keep up in terms of what you're saying. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because it's good that you're a lot more familiar with this than I am.
Yeah, there's a lot of blanks to fill in starting on volume 9 part 2.
I only have maybe a small amount of understanding of Jung, but that's not to say that I can't at least understand what he's writing, if that makes sense. Yeah. I find it actually a good guide on what's going on in your unconscious here, and then what comes forth to the conscious level of understanding. I suppose here's an interesting thought. Can the persona that we put on, how is it that we can make it into a positive persona rather than a negative persona?
Yeah, I think it has to be authentic.
Mm-hmm.
You can't be putting on fronts or putting on airs. And I think there is a time in childhood development where kids actually try on different roles. It's part of like role development. So a kid, I don't know, he gets that, do you know, like fake lawnmower that has little
Yeah.
balls that bounce up when you roll the wheels.
Yeah, I know what you're talking
So
about.
like the kid's like trying being dad for a day or something and has this fake lawnmower. Uh, I think there is a part of play that requires putting on roles. Hey, let's play house, says the little girl. You'll
Mm-hmm.
be mom in the kitchen, and I'll be waiting on the couch asking for an omelet. Uh, yes, so Jung's okay with personas being like compensating a situation. I think his issue with role playing is when persona just means mask, so it's like glued to your face that you can't
Mm-hmm.
dissociate your identity from the airs you're putting on, or from like the caricature you're trying to be.
Okay.
Um, should we get to shadow pretty soon?
Yeah, I think one question is here. I do want to touch on as a practical means is, um, well, I'll read out the whole question that I do have. How can we listen to others in regards to our unconscious actions so that we may be a more integrated person? So I guess a better way of being more concise is how can we be a more integrated person? And I think you answered it was authenticity. So now I do want to mention this in regards to authenticity. There's a point where authenticity, where you're trying to say, oh, I'm just trying to be my true authentic self. Are you? Or are you letting your shadow take over? Because
do you mean like the postmodernist artists that
yeah.
their art exhibit is like turning a light switch on and off?
Yeah.
And
Oh,
like,
yeah. I saw that. I thought that was hilarious. I was like, what?
what's the other one? They like took a urinal and put it sideways and signed it. It's like,
yeah, that's no.
it's like, I'm being very authentic. This is avant-garde. And it's to a point like your art has nothing to say about the human condition.
Yeah.
You're not expanding the boundary at all. You're trying to be incoherent, and good job you are. But
yeah.
yeah, that I would agree that would be a garbage version of authenticity where
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'd say as well as be honest. Now, there's a difference between being an absolute jerk when you're saying, I'm just being honest, versus being honest in trying to being helpful. I don't know how else to put it because I don't want to spend too much time on it. We could talk more about it, but we can move on to the shadow here. The good stuff, even though all this stuff I'm sure was pretty good.
yeah.
I think I'll start off with a question here. For the shadow, how can we see it in ourselves so that it does not control us?
Yeah, let me start with the definition. The shadow is the parts of the personality that the ego, or which is the center of the conscious mind, rejects. Think of like a Jekyll and Hyde situation. Dr. Jekyll, esteemed chemist, and then Mr. Hyde is kind of this like depraved and murderous. Anytime you see like a duality in popular media, I think there was even a Rick and Morty show about like.
I don't know. I only saw up to the first episode of season 3. I haven't seen, but I get what you're saying though.
Yeah, anytime you have like a duality, like, oh, this person, then their evil twin, or this person, their doppelganger, it's usually like an ego shadow type way of thinking. So the shadows are dark parts of personality which are rejected by the ego. And yeah, Jung's view, we've talked about what's it called? The individuation process. Yeah. His view is that the goal of the human is to find wholeness. And on the search for wholeness, your unconscious mind creates or manifests certain archetypes that there are these autonomous things under the threshold of perception that have some amount of autonomy and move things around and change the way you perceive the world. That the integration process is encountering certain archetypes and kind of coming to peace with them until you're basically whole.
Mm-hmm.
Although you'll still maybe interact with archetypes after them, but they're like a version of it that you've made peace with. Yeah, repeat your question again about the shadow.
Yeah, for the shadow, how can we see it in ourselves so that it does not get out of control, or that it does not control us?
Yeah, I think Jung would almost go against repression.
Mm-hmm.
That there's this amount of repression that could occur, and then your shadow kind of has outbursts. Like you lose control, you get really angry at work, you throw a stapler at Linda. Sorry, Linda. Yeah, so the shadow, if it repressed, it kind of creates outbursts, and then there's this. So that's like a conscious version of ignoring the shadow, is that you're just trying to stuff it down. The unconscious form is you kind of ignore it unconsciously, like you don't really think it's a problem. And Jung's idea is that this leads to projections, where you take the dark parts of yourself and put them on someone else. So if I'm kind of a slimy guy, I might interpret other people as being untrustworthy or lying all the time, when really for me it's a myself, truth, integrity issue that is kind of core to my being.
Mm-hmm.
Or, I accuse someone of being jealous, but I'm really someone that struggles with jealousy.
Yeah.
So the conscious form is a repression, which usually leads to outbursts, and the unconscious form is projection, which leads to seeing, he says, casting your shadow on someone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think. Did you have something else?
I could ramble for hours, please.
Okay, so I'm thinking of it in a practical term. So think about something within yourself that might not be something that you want to be exhibited. This is what I do for myself anyways. Acknowledging that bad part of yourself and not denying it.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine somebody struggling with, I don't know, certain sexual proclivities. Some people try to push that down and repress it. I'd say don't repress that. Don't try to push that down. If it's something that you don't want to succumb to, acknowledge it in its full entirety and saying, okay, this is something that I feel and I acknowledge it. But at the same time, doesn't mean I have to give in to it. Or what's another good one? I suppose drug use. If that can be used. I'm not really, I can't relate to that, but I think it's, let's say I'm never going to do drugs again. I'm not going to have the desire to do it. Well, and then a week later you're back smoking weed or whatever substance you're on. I think a good acknowledgement of it is an old Greek saying is know thyself. And understanding that part of yourself, saying, well, this is a certain unhealthy desire that I might have, is starting to integrate that shadow within you. At least this is how I've done it with myself. You have to acknowledge the flaws that you have within you and be willing to say, I am not as good of a person as I think I am. You have to be willing to acknowledge your faults. Every single fault that you might have. But don't beat yourself up so hard that you can't function in life, if that makes sense. Acknowledge those horrible parts within yourself, but then learn, how can I use this horrible part of myself to my own advantage? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think.
But like I said, don't go to the point of trying to nitpick every little part of yourself of I'm every horrible thing in this. Basically what I'm trying to say is acknowledge where you're most weak at and then bring that to the consciousness of your mind and acknowledge, okay, this is what something that I need to work on, and I'll do steps X, Y, and Z, even if it's not a specific order.
Yeah, maybe I'll use the example of anger.
I like that better.
You can, kind of repress your anger, and then you have random outbursts. And for Jung, he would say, okay, that's okay. There's certainly like things that you can get righteously mad about. The goal is to maybe integrate that anger so you respond to situations the first time that rub you the wrong way rather than kind of passively ignoring it, and then you just get so fed up with someone that you outburst. So for anger, like a better, more integrated version would be maybe learning to respond to your environment in live time better rather than find yourself cornered and then lash out. Like you're not putting down the anger, but yeah, you're not giving into like a murderous instinct. Rather, you're trying to find the useful parts of the shadow, which is the personality which you rejected, and then kind of sprinkling it into I guess just your personality to make it more balanced.
That's a good way of putting it. I also think having a good outlet to, some people would say martial arts would be a good outlet for that. I'm sure there's certain martial artists who probably misuse that and probably don't realize it. So I guess it's the shadow being expressed in a different way rather than properly integrating it. So I suppose actually the shadow would be something more of the mind rather than, would you say, something of the mind that becomes expressive? And what I mean by mind is the immaterial mind.
Yeah, I think it's something, to reject something out of your conscious conception of yourself and kind of kick to the curb things out of like, no, this is not who I am, and put in your unconscious mind. That kind of just coalesces and starts to have some amount of, I guess, personality in the unconscious mind. You might need to re-ask your question. I guess that's kind of close to how I frame it.
Yeah. The first question that I asked in regards to the shadow of
the
how
one
to
you just asked.
Oh. I don't remember. For the shadow, how can we see it in ourselves so that it doesn't get out of control?
Okay.
Is that the one that you're referring to?
No, I think you just asked one, and I was trying to reframe it, and then when I was reframing it, I just forgot what it was.
Yeah. Unfortunately, my mind's drawing a blank as well. I'm sure somebody will rewind like 20 seconds ago. It's like, how can you forget this? I'm like, I have no clue.
Yeah, so the shadow, it is kind of similar to Freud's version of the id. Jung says the shadow is autonomous. So like I said, it actually operates in your unconscious, and it could, sabotage you or whatnot if it's unresolved. The shadow is emotional. It has a primitive nature, and it's just incapable of moral judgment.
Yeah, I think I kind of like Jung's understanding of the shadow better than Freud's id. Freud's id seems to be too simplistic. while the shadow seems to be more something that you can use and integrate within yourself.
What's your views on his idea of projection of the shadow?
Oh, I think it goes further in the next chapter, which I don't think we'll be able to get to. But I think in regards to projection, that is a very good question. I think if we're not aware of our shadow, you see those YouTube compilations of Karen outburst or guys having an outburst of something over, you got my order wrong. It's like, come on, people. But I think as well, it's not even just outbursts that are just like that. I think projections are things that we are not aware of. That's, I'm trying to find the right words to use. I think it's you're projecting either an insecurity of yourself onto somebody else, or your own personal shortcoming on yourself to somebody else. So let's say somebody else is successful and you're not. You'll say something in regards to, that might be, I don't know, you might see a negative characteristic where there is none. And it might be you projecting a subconscious negative characteristic that you have of yourself, that you're not fully aware of yourself, that you're projecting on somebody else.
Yeah, I don't know if that would be jealousy.
That would be good understanding.
And if you're jealous, maybe you could question their motives, like, oh, they're just greedy, or they, like, you'll make up some sort of excuse for why their success is not legitimate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, well, I'll go a little bit into the next chapter. I don't want to go too far into it because we'll save that for next time. But it's basically the understanding of male and female, and the male kind of projecting his insecurities onto the female because of his own inadequacies, and the female feeling, I guess, dominated by the male in such a way to where she feels inadequate, or where she feels like she has to overpower the male. But I suppose I'm kind of going in a cloud of thought where I'm just trying to pull things out of thin air, or not out of thin air, but trying to pull from a realm of ideas.
Yeah, and maybe to just give a little bit of a roadmap.
Yeah.
So
I think I'll let you go with this because you're probably going to be a bit more concise than I am.
Yeah, so Jung's view is that like the goal of the human is to have wholeness through the integration process or individuation process. So there's the ego, which is kind of the part of the conscious mind that can make some amount of decisions. And you're talking earlier about accepting your shadow, that the ego actually needs to integrate the shadow, not the other way around. Mm-hmm. That the ego has to be the active agent in the integration, that unconscious problems don't just resolve themselves. He even says it takes, I'm paraphrasing, but like moral fortitude to address your shadow, that it's kind of a brave thing to do, to like challenge the dark parts of your nature. So Jung's individuation process, typically it's like you integrate your shadow, and then you integrate your anima or animus, and then you integrate yourself, the self with like a capital S, big S self.
Yeah. That sounds like something else you were saying.
Big S self.
Yes.
But yeah, so that's kind of the flow of these chapters. He talks about the ego, and then the shadow, and then the anima and animus, and then the self. So yeah, and those three at the end, they're kind of, he views them as kind of the main archetypes for someone's individuation, although he says that other archetypes could pop up too in the process.
Mm-hmm.
The tyrannical father could pop up, or nature as an archetype could pop up, or the wise old man could pop up. So he kind of used those three as maybe like a start. So that's kind of where how this book reads a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we should just do some closing thoughts on ego and then shadow.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. I was kind of thinking the same thing too. So I think ego. Well, since I'm thinking more of a practical, and you're good with understanding the abstract ideas, and I'm kind of trying to bring it down to a more practical level here. I think in regards to the ego, what is it that you yourself are aware of currently that is a good part? But then in regards to the shadow, what are some things that might be bad parts of yourself that you may be unaware of in the moment, but then realize later, like, why did I do that? Think about that moment of why did I do this bad thing? And then consider, is this the part of my shadow that I need to put into myself or integrate within my conscious ego personality?
So it's like getting in cycles and realizing, hey, why do I keep on burning bridges in my relationships? Or why does this whatever thing just keep on rearing its ugly head and happening in circles? Like, that could be a shadow conflict if
Yeah.
That's fair.
Or burning bridges, anger, letting, I know our culture is all about sexuality, but letting certain sexual behaviors get out of control, going to whatever websites people are going to. Let's see, what else? I suppose think about your own personal relationships, whether it be with friends, co-workers, parents, spouse. Think about how, or even children, think about how you're interacting with them. If something is getting on your nerves about them, wonder why is it that what they're doing is getting on my nerves? And even, let's say you're saying, why is what they're doing so that is so benign getting on my nerves?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I don't think it's a marital thing. Sometimes I think it's a you thing. Because there's a quote from a famous preacher, Charles Spurgeon, that says, if somebody's speaking ill about you, don't worry, you're worse than what they're saying.
Yeah, I think you're right with that. Like, why am I oversensitive to this? Or why does my ego go to defend this thing?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why am I defending this false self? Why do I have to become so protective over this?
Yeah. I don't really have anything else. Do you have any other final closing thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just summarize. So ego, a center of the conscious mind, although there's other things in a conscious mind, such as the persona and like the roles you play and the masks you put on. Ego's kind of the decision maker of the conscious mind. It's the executive office. And then the shadow is the parts of your personality rejected by the ego. And yeah, that's about as far as we got in this journey of Jung.
Yeah, I think next chapter will be fascinating. I don't know if we'll probably try to get through the next chapter, but there's just so much good stuff here. It's blowing my mind. Anyways, I got nothing else.
Yeah, well, that's about it. Feel free to email us at theimprovsophypodcast@gmail.com if you have any questions, comments, concerns, qualms, queries.
Quotations.
Yes, just quote a book and send it to us. Say, you were wrong about Volume 9, Part 2 of Jung.
I'm gonna be surprised if a Jungian psychologist actually emails us like, "Hey, you have some interesting things," or "You guys are absolute idiots. You don't know what you're talking about." Anyways, that's it for me.
Yeah. Be well. Take care of yourselves. Bye.